The corner table by the back window was the coldest seat in Millhaven's public library, and every Thursday evening without fail a man named Elias Croft sat down in it like he owned the cold. I've heard a lot of stories in my time. Stories about men who built things, men who lost things, men who spent their whole lives pretending not to need anything from anybody. Elias was all three, and I'm not sure he knew it, but someone else did, and that's what this story is really about. Elias Drummond Croft was 41 years old and had the hands of a man who'd spent 2 decades putting fence posts into hard ground. He ran a cattle operation out past the ridge, about 6 miles east of town, the kind of spread that looked like it would outlast him and probably would. He drove in every Thursday in a truck with a cracked side mirror he'd never bothered to replace, parked in the same spot on the street, and walked through the library's front door without glancing at the hours posted in the window. He always wore the same canvas jacket the color of old creek mud, and he never once said hello to the woman at the desk unless she said it first. That woman was Margaret Elaine Boone. She was 37. Ran the Millhaven branch of the county library system with the kind of efficiency that made the county board nervous because it left them with nothing to complain about. She had dark hair she kept pinned up during working hours, a handwriting so precise it looked printed, and a habit of noticing things that most people assumed went unnoticed. The kind of noticing that wasn't nosiness, it was closer to care. She noticed, for instance, that Elias always sat at the cold corner table. She noticed that he never checked anything out. She noticed on his third Thursday that he spent 40 minutes with a ranching almanac open in front of him and never once turned a page. Most people in her position would have offered to help, or offered, loudly, in a way that made the help feel like an accusation. Margaret did neither. She walked past his table on her way to reshelve a cart of returns, set a single book down at the far edge of his table without breaking stride, and kept going. He looked at the book. It was a field guide to range grasses illustrated, the pictures large and clearly labeled. He didn't pick it up right away. He let it sit there for a while, the way a man lets a thing sit when he's deciding whether or not to trust it. Then quietly, when no one was looking, he opened it to the first page. I want you to understand something before I go further. Elias Croft was not a foolish man. He was not lazy, not incurious, not the kind of person who couldn't follow a conversation or understand what was happening around him. He had built his ranch from 40 acres and a borrowed tractor. He could read a weather pattern, negotiate with a feed supplier, fix a hydraulic line in the dark. But written words had always scrambled on him, the letters shifting just enough that reading felt like trying to watch something through moving water. He'd made it most of his life by memorizing what he needed to memorize and staying quiet about the rest. He was very good at staying quiet about the rest. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Margaret never asked why he always chose that particular table, or why he never had a library card, or why he held books at a slight angle when he looked at them, like he was trying to catch the words at a different slant. She noticed all of it, she said none of it, but the books near his corner tables started to change, quietly without announcement. An illustrated history of American cattle drives, a photography book on the high plains. Things a man might find interesting even if the words gave him trouble, things he could spend time with. He picked them up. He turned the pages, slowly, like he was learning something. He was. By the 6th week, Margaret had left a slim volume at his table. Not a picture book, a short story collection, large print, the kind they kept in the senior section. She'd slipped a bookmark in at the first page of the first story. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up, and for the first time in 6 weeks he looked directly at her. She was at the circulation desk, approximately 20 feet away, helping a woman return a stack of audiobooks. She was not looking at him, she was writing something in her notepad, her pen moving with that precise, unhurried purpose she had about everything. He looked back at the book. He opened it to the bookmark, and he started to read. It was slow. It was not pretty. There were words he had to go back over, sentences he had to sit with until they gave up their meaning. A man who does not know how to swim will tell you that the hardest part is not the water. The hardest part is not backing away from the edge. Elias sat in that cold corner chair and did not back away. He was still on the first page when the library closed at 8 o'clock. Margaret walked past his table with her keys in her hand. He stood up, put his jacket on, and left the book on the table as he always left things. Untouched, returned to exactly where he'd found them, as if he'd never been there. A man practiced in leaving no trace. She picked up the book after he'd gone through the door. She opened to the first story and looked at the page. He had made it to the 3rd paragraph. She put the bookmark back in at paragraph 4. I have thought about that moment many times since I first heard this story. The smallness of it. The bookmark moved forward exactly 3 paragraphs. It's such a quiet thing to do for another person. So quiet that it doesn't even feel like doing something. It just feels like paying attention. But I have come to believe that paying attention is one of the most radical things a person can offer another human being. Elias came back the following Thursday. He found the bookmark at paragraph 4. He sat with that for a while. Then he kept reading. By November he was checking books out. He'd gotten a library card, filled out the form himself, which Margaret placed table one evening alongside a pen, casually, the way you might set down a glass of water for someone who hadn't admitted they were thirsty. His handwriting on the form was large and uneven and real, and she filed it the same as she filed every other card, without ceremony, without comment. His name in the system: Elias D. Croft. Address on Route 9. No email. She typed it in. She moved on, but she noticed, because she noticed everything, that he'd started coming in on Tuesday evenings as well. Not just Thursdays. The library was quieter on Tuesdays. Fewer people, less noise from the children's section. He could sit with something without managing the awareness of being watched. She understood that. She gave him the same steady indifference she gave the space around him. Not coldness, not disregard, but a particular kind of privacy that only happens when someone is deliberately protecting it. He was working through a series of short westerns, the kind with plain language and plenty of action. She didn't consider them beneath him. She considered them exactly right. One Tuesday in December she was closing up later than usual, waiting on a county system update to finish running on her computer, when she heard a sound from the back corner. She looked up. Elias was still at his table. He had a paperback open and his lips were moving very slightly, the way they do when a person is sounding out a word they don't quite trust yet. He was so absorbed in the page that he hadn't noticed how late it had gotten, hadn't noticed the overhead lights had dimmed to the closing hour setting, hadn't noticed he was the only person left in the building. Margaret watched him for exactly as long as it took her to make sure she'd seen what she thought she'd seen. Then she turned back to her computer and let the update keep running. She didn't leave for another 20 minutes. She said nothing about any of this. Later she would say it wasn't about not embarrassing him, though that was part of it. It was more that what she'd seen wasn't hers to hold up to the light, it was his. Every page he'd fought through, every morning he'd gotten out of bed and driven a ranch and managed a life with words scrambling beneath him, that belonged to him. She was just the librarian. She kept the books available. What people did with them was their own. She genuinely believed that. I genuinely believe she believed it. But there's a difference between not interfering and not caring, and Margaret Boone knew exactly which side of that line she was standing on. It was February when things changed, not dramatically, not in the way stories often change, with a confrontation or a declaration or a door slamming. It was smaller than that. February is often smaller than you expect. There had been a bad stretch of weather, the kind that keeps cattle ranchers awake and driving fence lines in the dark. Elias had missed 2 Tuesdays and a Thursday. And when he came back in the first week of February, he looked like he'd spent those 3 weeks doing exactly what he had. Sleeping very little, working very hard, carrying something that hadn't gotten lighter. He sat down in his corner with his jacket still on and stared at the table. Margaret was at the cart pulling new acquisitions. She walked past his table, set down a cup of coffee in a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve, and kept moving without pausing and without explanation. The library technically did not allow outside beverages in the reading area. The coffee was from the diner 2 doors down. She had bought it on her lunch break 6 hours ago and left it on the warmer at the circulation desk, because she had thought he might come in this week, and he sometimes looked like a man who hadn't eaten since morning. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked across the room at her. She didn't look up. He drank the coffee. He stayed until closing. On his way out, he stopped at the desk. This was new. He had never stopped at the desk on his way out, only occasionally on his way in to return something. "That almanac," he said. "The one on range grasses, you still got it? 3rd shelf. Naturals heterosection," she said, and told him the call number without looking it up. He nodded. "I've been trying to cross-reference something. I can pull some extension service bulletins too, if that helps. They tend to run shorter." He looked at her steadily for a moment. She looked back, not unkindly, not with anything she'd need to take back later. "That'd be helpful," he said. "I'll have them on Tuesday." He nodded again and left. "I want to stop here for a second because this exchange probably doesn't look like much on the surface. 2 people discussing agricultural reference materials. But here is what I want you to hear." Elias Croft, for the first time in his 41 years, told someone, out loud directly, that he was trying to understand something he'd been reading. That he was reading. That he was attempting to cross-reference. He said those things to another person without the floor collapsing under him. That is not a small thing. For some people, that is the whole mountain. The extension bulletins were on his table Tuesday as promised. She'd pulled 6 of them, paper-clipped a note to the top one with the most relevant section marked. The note said, "Page 4, Table 2. Compares yield by grass type and elevation. Might match what you're looking at." It was her handwriting. Practical, unadorned, no signature. He sat with those bulletins for 3 hours. When he left, he took them with him. Under the regulations, you couldn't check out reference materials. But Margaret Boone had already recatalogued them as standard circulars before she'd put them on his table. She'd done that quietly, while the morning was still empty, before he arrived. She was like that. Thorough in ways that weren't designed to be seen. Spring came the way spring comes to that part of the country. Reluctantly in fits and starts, with cold mornings that still held enough winter to mean business. Elias kept coming in. He was on novels now, proper ones, 200 and 300 pages. His pace was still slow most measures, but his pace was his own and he'd stopped apologizing for it, internally at least. The way he held a book had changed, less tentative, more settled. Margaret noticed that too. She didn't say so. What she did in mid-March was set a notepad on his table, blank, line spiral bound. The kind used for sketching. He looked at it. She was across the room talking to a woman about the interlibrary loan system. She wasn't watching him, she was never openly watching him. That was the thing about Margaret. She looked at you most clearly when she wasn't appearing to look at all. He picked up the notepad, he set it back down, he opened the novel he'd been working through, a story about a cattleman in Montana in the 1920s, and he read for a while. Then he opened the notepad, he wrote a few lines, took a long time over it, crossed something out, wrote again. He closed the notepad and put it in his jacket pocket when he left. This is where I should tell you something about Margaret Boone, that maybe I should have told you sooner. She had not always been a woman who paid attention to people, or rather, she had always paid attention. But for most of her adult life she had considered that a liability. She'd grown up in a family where noticing too much meant worrying too much, and worrying had been treated as a weakness. So she'd spent years building a life that was extremely organized and involved very few people who required her noticing. The library had changed that. You cannot work in a library and not begin to understand, eventually, that what people check out and what they carry in and what they circle around is a kind of autobiography. She had learned to read people the way she read text. Not for what was on the surface, but for what was underneath it, the gap between what was said and what was meant, the way a person's hand hesitates before turning a page. She had been alone for a long time. Not unhappily. But the aloneness had settled into something permanent feeling. The way furniture you've had for 20 years starts to feel like it was always there. She had not planned for a man in a canvas jacket to sit in her coldest corner every Thursday and make her wonder what he was carrying. She hadn't planned for it. But she was not a woman who looked away from things she noticed. In April, Elias Croft asked Margaret Boone if she ever took lunch outside. He said it's Nancy at the circulation desk, returning a novel, not quite looking at her. The way a man asks something when he's prepared for the answer to be no, and is hoping to get through the asking with his dignity more or less intact. She said she did sometimes, when the weather was decent. He said the bench on the side of the building got afternoon sun. She said she'd noticed that. He said, "I could bring something from the diner, if you don't mind." She looked at him for a moment. He finally met her eyes. "I don't mind," she said. He nodded once the way he did and left to go pick up the food, and she stood at the circulation desk for a moment after the door closed. Then she smiled. Not at anyone, just to herself, in the way you do when something you'd been careful not to hope for happens anyway. He came back with 2 sandwiches in a paper bag, and they sat on the bench in the April sun, and talked about the water table and a book she'd been meaning to read for 3 years, and the problem with the county's road maintenance schedule. They talked for 45 minutes. He was quieter than her, she was sharper than him, and somewhere in the back half of that conversation, they both understood that this was going to keep happening. It did. By June he was meeting her for lunch twice a week. By August he'd shown her the ranch. It was a Tuesday evening just before closing when he came in and set the spiral notepad on the circulation desk. Margaret looked at it. "I wrote something," he said. "I don't know if it's any good. I don't have a way to know, but I wanted you to have it." She picked up the notepad, she opened it. The handwriting was still uneven, still large, still working against itself in places. But it was legible, every word of it, and it was deliberate, every word chosen. It was about the ranch in early morning. About the particular color of the sky before sunrise, which he described as the color of a bruise that was finally healing. About the sound of the herd settling in from the night. About driving the fence line in February and stopping the truck to watch a hawk sit perfectly still on a post in a wind that would have moved anything less certain of itself. It was not a long piece, maybe 300 words, maybe 4, but it was true in the way that only certain things are true. Not factually, though it was that too, but true in the way that means a person wrote it instead of performed it. Margaret read it through once. She read it again. She set it down on the desk and looked at him. "How long did it take you to write this?" she said. 3 weeks, he said. "Did you know you could write like this?" "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was not pity and not admiration, but something between them that might not have a clean name. Recognition maybe, the acknowledgement of something seen. "You should keep writing," she said. He looked at the notepad. "I'd like to give you this one, then I'll keep it." "Okay," she said. He turned to leave. At the door he stopped, the way he sometimes did, though for a long time it had meant he'd forgotten to return something. This time it meant something else. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. "I know you knew," he said, "from the beginning, what I was working on." She didn't say anything for a moment. "I figured you were getting there," she said. He stood at the door with his hand on the frame, the way a man stands when he's decided to be honest and is still getting used to what that feels like. "I've been trying to say thank you for a long time," he said. I couldn't find words that weren't too small. These are fine, she said. He nodded. He left. She stood at the circulation desk for a while after. The building was quiet. The evening was coming down outside the windows. The particular blue of late summer dusk that only lasts a few minutes before it goes gray. She picked up the notepad. She put it under the desk with her personal things to take home. She kept it on the shelf above her desk at home for the rest of the time she lived in Millhaven, through the following winter, through the spring when she started driving out to the ranch on Sunday evenings, through the year after that when the drives became a standing arrangement, that neither of them formally named but both of them kept. She kept it because it was the truest thing a person had ever given her. Not the first thing he'd tried to say, but the first thing he'd managed to say exactly right, in the words he'd fought to learn, on pages he'd filled with the effort of it, about a life that had been lonelier than he'd ever admitted to anyone. He saw the whole of her too, eventually. The way she organized things to avoid having to ask for help. The way she deflected compliments like they were something to be survived. The way she'd spent 20 years making herself so capable there was no obvious place for another person to step in. He stepped in anyway, quietly, the way she'd taught him without meaning to. That's the thing I want you to take from this story. I have known a lot of people in my life who believe that love, real love, the kind that holds, has to arrive loudly, has to declare itself, has to sweep something off a shelf or stop traffic or say the perfect thing at the perfect moment. And I understand why people believe that. It makes for a better movie. But what I've seen, in the people who actually make it work, is something much quieter than that. It's the bookmark moved 3 paragraphs forward. It's the coffee brought 6 hours ahead of time. It's the notepad left on a corner table without explanation. It's the decision made again and again without fanfare, to keep noticing another person even when they're doing everything they can to go unnoticed. Elias Croft sat in the coldest corner of that library for 6 weeks before he let himself pick up the book she'd left him. And Margaret Boone never once, not once, made him feel that the waiting had been inconvenient. Do you know how rare that is? So I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know, has anyone ever noticed you that way? The whole of you, the part you were ashamed of, the part you were still working on, the part you hadn't found words for yet. Tell me in the comments. I read them, and if no one has noticed you that way yet, I hope this story is a reminder that someone still might.